All right, folks, so this is the brand new Polar Vantage M3. So this is Polar's latest full-featured multi-sport watch, and this is basically a smaller version of their higher-end Vantage V3, but it also comes with a much smaller price tag. And what's interesting is that it basically has all the same features. So it has an AMOLED touchscreen display. It has their same fourth generation heart rate sensor with ECG. It has blood oxygen saturation tracking. It has skin temperature tracking. It has dual-band GPS, and it even has offline maps. And from a software standpoint, this Vantage M3, the Vantage V3, as well as the Grit X2 Pro are actually all going to be sharing the same software platform moving forward. So what makes this actually different? Well, it all basically comes down to the size and the materials, and that makes this a whopping $200 less than the Vantage V3. But as you can tell, this is actually a really good looking watch. So this is going to be kind of a two-part review, and the main reason for that is that alongside the announcement of the Vantage M3, they're also announcing a brand new 3.0 firmware that's coming to all their flagship watches early next year. So in this video, we'll go over what's new with the Vantage M3, as well as what it shares in common with the Vantage V3, as well as the Grit X2 Pro. And we'll also talk about some of the new features that they have slated for their next big version of their software, and then I'll have a follow-up video going over all those features coming up early next year. Okay, so for the hardware, this is basically a more svelte version of the Vantage V3, where this has a 44mm case that's about 12mm thick, and it weighs about 53 grams without the band. And it's launching in two different colors. So there's this black version that I have right here, as well as this grayish sand color, I think is how they say it. Black is definitely always in style, but I do have to give them a lot of kudos on that sand color with the gold accents. That's a really good looking watch. So just like their Vantage V3 as well as the Grit X2 Pro, the M3 also rocks an AMOLED display, but it is just a smidge smaller due to the smaller case, where this has a 1.28-inch AMOLED display. And just like the Vantage V3, it's also protected with Gorilla Glass. But one of the biggest material differences between the Vantage V3 and the M3 is that the M3 has a resin main case where the V3 is mostly aluminum, but the M3 still does have a stainless steel bezel, which does really make it pop. And the AMOLED display is great both indoors as well as outdoors, and there's definitely no issue seeing it in all sorts of conditions. And one kind of interesting detail is that the M3 actually has a max brightness of 1500 nits versus the 10,050 nits on the V3 and the Grit X2 Pro. But again, to be honest with you, I really couldn't tell much of a difference. They all look fine in all conditions. And then when it comes to the watch band, so the M3 uses industry standard 22mm watch bands, and this stock band is pretty good for the most part, where it has a good amount of stretch and it's pretty comfortable. I kind of wish though that it had a nylon band option like their Vantage V3, but that's something that I can easily add in the future. But being that these are industry standard bands, you can just go ahead and swap these out with tons of third-party options. And then to get around the device, it has a really bright AMOLED touchscreen display, and it also does have physical buttons, just like every other sports watch really should, so you can navigate throughout the menus and interface with either depending on your situation. And getting around the device is pretty snappy here too, and this certainly has been a big improvement with Polar's recent flagship watches, where these are pretty quick to get around and there's really not much delay at all. Now, even though getting around the interface is pretty quick and all, I do feel that their actual interface feels a little bit dated at this point and really needs a refresh. And I mentioned this in my Vantage V3 as well as my Grit X2 Pro review. They are going to be doing some things with their 3.0 firmware, but we'll get to that here in just one bit. And then on the battery life end of things, so this has an advertised battery life of up to 7 days in smartwatch mode. So basically like if you're just using it as a smartwatch without recording any workouts or anything like that. Now, battery life will kind of vary on how much you interact with your watch, other settings like brightness, as well as how many activities that you track. But I've been getting around 5 days out of it, and that's actually while using the always on display mode, as well as recording about an hour-long outdoor activity per day. But when it comes to battery life, specifically for recording outdoor workouts, they say that it can last up to 30 hours in their highest accuracy performance training mode, and then you can extend that to 70 hours if you'd like with their eco training mode, where that reduces the sampling rate of GPS. But for a real world example, so in this right here, I started at 38%, and at the end of about a 2-hour ride or a little over 2-hour ride, it used about 10%, but I was using it always on display. So in that sort of configuration, you could potentially record like a 22-hour long continuous activity. And then for health features and health sensors, again, this is going to be the same as the Vantage V3 as well as the Grit X2 Pro. So it has the 4th generation heart rate sensor. It also has wrist ECG, although it's not an FDA approved version like what you get on an Apple Watch or a Garmin. It also has blood oxygen saturation tracking, and then it also has skin temperature tracking. And then from a health tracking standpoint, so that's going to all be the same here too, where it does have sleep tracking with sleep stages. And then there's also their nightly recharge feature, which I do find to be one of the better implementation of tracking sleep and recovery that I found. I really just feel like it's an easy to understand metric that provides a pretty accurate reflection of my sleep quality as well as my recovery. And then it also has their boost feature as well as their sleep gate feature, which, well, those I actually don't necessarily find those to be as useful, at least for me. So their boost feature is supposed to kind of predict certain periods throughout the day when you may be the most energized, but at least for me, I don't necessarily feel like they line up with how I really feel, but they may be useful for some of you out there. And then on the sports side of things, again, all the same kind of training feedback like their other flagship watches, like they have their cardio load status feature as well as their training load pro. It also has their fuel-wise nutrition and hydration reminders during an activity, and it also has running power from the wrist itself. Another feature that comes over from their other watches is their Fit Smart training guidance, and this is a pretty novel feature where it suggests different kinds of workouts based on previous training as well as your recovery. So like in this day here, it's suggesting some core workout or some easy cardio, even though I only had a fairly easy 1 hour bike ride the day before. However, my sleep and recovery was pretty terrible, so even though it's suggesting up to a 2-hour long cardio session, it's saying like zone 1 or 2, which is basically all my buddy's really ready to do. Now, one of the most surprising things for me, at least, is that it also has a dual frequency GNSS chipset, which I was kind of expecting single band on this M model, but they went ahead and put that in here, which is great, of course. Now, just putting a dual band chipset into a watch doesn't necessarily just automatically mean it gets great accuracy. So there's other factors involved, like the antenna design, that play a factor in how accurate a watch actually will be. And I found the GPS tracks to be really, really good, like really solid on all the straight sections and really tight through all the corners and curves. Like we can go through this entire ride and there's not one fault that I could really see. However, I did find that the total distance that was collected was just a little shorter than some of the other devices. Nothing necessarily earth-shattering, but just enough to notice. And then on the navigation side of things, again, this was kind of a surprise for me, where the M3 also has full offline maps, and it also has the same 32 gigabytes of storage for all those maps, just like the V3. Now, these maps are map images, meaning that you'll see trails, streets, and bodies of water, but it doesn't necessarily have labels like you'd find on something like a Garmin. However, it does come with some of their enhancements that came with their 2.0 firmware of the V3, like GPX routes with actual breadcrumb trails. Now, when it comes to heart rate accuracy, even though the M3 uses the same heart rate sensor as the Grit X2 Pro as well as the Vantage V3, the results I got actually weren't quite as accurate as those other watches. So like for indoor cycling, there were just a few spots here or there where it was momentarily off. Nothing crazy, but just not quite the results I would expect for indoor cycling. And then for cycling outside, I did have this ride where it had a rather large portion right here where it wandered off, but then on this ride, it was definitely better, but still wasn't quite as accurate as the results I got out of the Grit X2 Pro or the Vantage V3. But I'll definitely revisit that with the 3.0 software release that's coming in a couple months. And I guess that's actually a good time to talk about what's coming in their new 3.0 firmware update that'll be coming to all their flagship watches. So the M3, the Vantage V3, as well as the Grit X2 Pro. So on the navigation side of things, they're going to be rolling out points of interest, which has been a huge request. So you'll soon be able to use points of interest for navigation versus having to load in a GPX route. And then they're also going to be rolling out a brand new workout interface where it's basically a new menu structure for when you launch a workout. And then they also have a whole bunch of new watch faces that are coming out, which also have new complications in a more horizontal manner versus circular. And then they're also going to have a new Find My Phone feature. And finally, and this is definitely an exciting one, is that there's also going to be Training Peaks integration coming later into. But finally, and this is a pretty exciting one, is that there's also going to be Training Peaks integration coming later in 2025. So that's pretty big from a structured training side of things. So there's definitely a lot of good things going for the Vantage M3, such as the fact that it's basically a smaller version of their higher-end Vantage V3, but most importantly, significantly cheaper, as the Vantage M3 is still a little bit overpriced in my opinion, where the $399 mark of the M3 I think is in a good place. And from a software standpoint, again, really awesome that they're basically keeping the V3, the M3, as well as the Grit X2 Pro all on the same path. But I think that gets me to my last point though, is that on the software side of things don't seem to move at as fast a pace as some other companies out there. And I'm not talking about Garmin or Apple or anything like that, but I'm talking more like Coros. I'm certainly excited for the 3.0 release that's coming next year, but it's not necessarily a huge list of features either. But I do think that there's some good news and some hope there, since they are keeping the same software path for all their flagship watches. So this in theory should mean more features for more watches and hopefully more often. Anyhow, that's the new Vantage M3 from Polar, and if you have any questions about it that I didn't cover in this video, feel free to drop those down in the comment section down below and I'll do my best to answer them. And if you found the information in this video to be useful, do me a favor and hit that like button down below, and also subscribe to the channel for plenty more sports tech videos that are right around the corner. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.